So as we get into things today, I'm going to actually start back a little bit with our gospel from last week, because it catches right up with where we are today. So in the gospel passage last week, Jesus spoke of the great cost of discipleship, that one must deny themselves, literally choose a different way than what we would choose, take up their cross, and follow Jesus. I think what Jesus is talking about here is a purposeful abandonment of giving up or abandoning our own goals, values, and priorities so that we can take up his instead. And he is so bold to say that those who wish to save their life, those who want to cling to their life above all else, that they will in fact lose everything. But those who freely give of their life for the sake of Jesus and the gospel, that they will save it. And the disciples hear all of this. And if you remember from last week, they don't know at all what it means. And then, in between that gospel and this one, 3 of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, hear it again at the Transfiguration, that Jesus is going to die and rise again on the 3rd day, and again, nothing seems to be clicking. And in today's passage, they again hear about this betrayal, death, and resurrection. You guys think they're going to do any better with it this time around? No, they're not. I don't think they are either. See, this passage goes so far as to say that they did not understand what he was saying, and even more importantly, they were afraid to ask. So after Jesus has been open about this, teaching them time and time again about it, they are still afraid to ask the question. And this reminded me of a joke that I like. So there was someone who got hired in to be a line painter, and this is, years ago, before they had those nice shopping carts that they'll walk and paint the lines on the road now, when someone had to go out with a bucket and a roller and paint lines down the road, and this person got hired, and they said, all right, we want you to come on out, want you to paint for 10 feet, take 10 feet off, paint for another 10 feet, and keep on going, go as far as you can today, and I'll check in with you afterwards. So the supervisor said, just take your bucket, set it down right here, and go and have at it. I'll see you at the end of the day. Supervisor came back later that day. They had painted 8 miles of road. Tremendous job. The average is 4, so they had just blown things away. Supervisor said, you did a great job. All right, we'll see you tomorrow. Supervisor comes in tomorrow, next day, looks, and, well, they've only painted 4 miles this time around. Said, well, it's a lot worse than you did yesterday, but it's still the average, so you're doing fine. And then the 3rd day comes around, and the supervisor comes in at the end of the day and says, you only painted 1 mile. What happened? And the worker looked at him and said, well, the bucket just kept getting further and further away. They had never stopped to question, well, do I take the bucket with me? You said just to set it here. So when we don't ask the question, sometimes we never fully get the answer. And here the disciples are both unaware of what's going on and unwilling to ask it. And I wonder if they're afraid to say something because they might suffer the same fate that Peter suffered in last week's gospel. If you remember the lovely line Jesus yells, "Get behind me, Satan," after Peter goes and rebukes Jesus. They don't want that verbal whiplash that Peter got before. Or maybe they're afraid that they would have their worldview broken, that what they hoped for and what they thought was going to happen wouldn't be the case. Maybe they were just in denial of what Jesus was trying to say to them. But then, after everything Jesus says about losing one's life, about denying themselves, about what he was going to go through as the Messiah, the disciples decide that on the way, they're going to have a little discussion. And they argue amongst themselves about who is going to be the greatest. And can you imagine that conversation? I mean, I know that the disciples went on later and they did wonderful, wonderful things, but we have to be honest with ourselves that at this point in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples do not have a very impressive resume. They are basically a bunch of knuckleheads. So fighting amongst themselves as to who's the best could pretty much look like a Three Stooges episode. They're just going at it. And in this passage, Jesus I think he does a great parenting trick where he doesn't say anything at the time, but then later catches them when they're unaware and says, "So what were you talking about?" And this is a passage that is simultaneously about being too quiet and about being too loud. The disciples are too quiet in the face of Jesus' honesty about who he is as the Messiah and what that means, and they're too loud as they argue amongst themselves about who is the greatest. And Jesus hears all of this, and he waits till they're at the house, and then he catches them in a little bit of a trap. Because I know, at least as a teenager, and maybe also as a husband, I've heard the phrase, "So what were you talking about?" when I know full well that that other person knows exactly what I was talking about. And in response to the disciples infighting amongst themselves about who is the greatest, Jesus takes a small child, lifts it up in his arms, and explains that greatness doesn't mean what you think it means. Greatness means to welcome a small, vulnerable child such as this. It says that when you welcome this child in my name, you welcome them in the name of God. And to be great means not to be the best among you, but to be the servant, the best servant of all, to be the least. And while it can sometimes be easier with a text like this to look at the disciples, to laugh, we sometimes overlook the glaring problem for us, that after 2,000 years, we as the church still struggle with this, that we don't have a whole lot of room to talk. And I think one of the main reasons is that we are still enamored with greatness, with being the best. What a tremendous motivator that it can be. I mean, when we talk about churches and greatness, we see churches that have multi-million-dollar buildings, the greatest sound system, the greatest projection equipment, the most wonderful social hall. What does it mean to be the greatest in those cases? And I'm not saying that greatness is terrible. Greatness pushes us. It can push us to do tremendous things. For instance, have you ever noticed that when it comes to the Olympics, over the course of history, running, like say you're doing a running event, times have gotten shorter, the weight that people lift has gotten higher? I did a quick look, and the men's marathon in 1968 would have, the time that the first place was in that one, would have placed 68th in the latest summer games. It was 16 minutes slower than the gold medal winner in Rio. See, there is a clear proof that this strive for greatness does get results. That when we push ourselves to be better, to do the next best thing, to continue to be better than the next person, results can happen. But the question that Jesus asked us, and the question that we need to ask ourselves, is do we get the results that Jesus would want his disciples to have? And I'm not just talking about those ones that were bumbling around following after him. I mean you and I mean me. Because if our strive for greatness places us on a pedestal above others, then we've missed the point of Jesus' teaching. And there's something different here amongst trying to push ourselves to be the best we can be, to be the greatest person that we can personally be. But when we are comparing ourselves to others, when we bicker amongst ourselves, who is the greatest, we've missed the mark. If we strive only for ourselves to excel and we leave behind the least of these, we're doing it wrong. Because by Jesus' own example, that's never what he did. See, instead of searching for greatness, Jesus hid his greatness at every turn. Instead of placing himself first, Jesus lifted up others. And instead of being the Messiah who took a crown of kingship, Jesus took a cross of sacrifice. He not only continues to redefine our understanding of Messiah, but he continues to redefine our understanding of greatness. And so when we talk about greatness, what it means as people of God to do great things, this is the lens that we have to look through. Not that we can compare ourselves to the church down the road and say our budget is better, or, well, we have the best choir. Greatness for us means who have we served lately? Greatness for us means how have the least of those around us been lifted up? I think it's an important message when we talk about Jesus lifting up a child in the midst of the disciples, that he lifted up a child who could give nothing back. In that day and age especially, a child was someone who did not have any value outside of what they would be as an adult. It was like a long-term investment. I'm really hoping this pays off, because otherwise I've invested a lot of money in nothing. Their value was defined by who they would become. But Jesus lifted up a child and said, this right here is a beloved one. This is someone who has value now. And when you welcome them, you welcome me. There's a story of a man who went to visit Mother Teresa. And as he was there, he asked Mother Teresa, show me the face of Christ. Let me hold Christ in my arms. And wasn't sure exactly what would happen, but Mother Teresa took him by the hand and walked him out of the clinic they were in. And she walked him down to the street, and there on the street was a beggar. It was a man who was clear that time, that hunger, that thirst had worn him away to almost nothing. And she looked at this man who had sought her out. She looked him in the face and said, if you want to hold Jesus in your hands, pick this man up and hold him. If you want to see Jesus' face, look this man in the eye. And Jesus says, when you welcome the least of these, you welcome me. We need to understand he's saying the truth. That when we go to serve those who are the least, we welcome Jesus into our midst. You know, I think it's easy to go out and to serve those who we can get something from. You know, a great stewardship plan is to find all the richest people in town and invite them to your church. But maybe that's not the greatness that Jesus calls us to. Maybe what we're called to do is to invite all of those who have nothing to give back. See, this is greatness in Jesus' eyes, to serve those whom would not be served otherwise. And so may we, even when we fail, may we know that we have a Savior who believes so wholeheartedly that serving the least of these shows love. Because there are times that even we who think we have it all might not feel it. There are times when we feel as though we might be the least of these. And I take great comfort knowing that Jesus comes to us, just as he calls us to go to each other. And so may you today know that we serve a Christ who cares much more about lifting up those who are lost, who are lonely, than he cares about lifting up those who are great. Amen.